The words left my son's mouth, sharp and cold as shattered glass, and in that moment, the entire world inside my little kitchen froze. "Cover up your old ugly face, Mom," Michael said, his voice dripping with a disdain I'd never heard from him before, not even in his most rebellious teenage years. He was leaning against the refrigerator, arms crossed over his crisp button-down shirt, a man of 27 who looked at me not with love, but with a kind of clinical disgust. My own breath hitched, and I could feel the familiar comforting smile I'd worn all morning simply dissolve, leaving behind the very face he found so offensive. I'd been buzzing with a secret happiness, whisking batter for his birthday cake, the one I made for him every single year since he was a little boy who'd smear frosting in his hair. Now the whisk felt heavy and foolish in my hand. He gestured with his chin towards the living room, where his new girlfriend, Chloe, was waiting. "Seriously, do you have to wear that same faded apron? And your hair, it's just so gray. Can't you do something with it? For me?" The request, wrapped in an insult, felt like a physical blow. This wasn't the Michael I knew. This wasn't the boy who used to fall asleep on my lap, his small hand fisted in my shirt, who told me I smelled like safety and home. I looked down at the apron, a relic from a county fair years ago, splattered with the ghosts of 1,000 meals, 1,000 laughter-filled dinners. It was a map of my life as his mother. And my hair? I'd earned every one of those silver strands during the long, lonely nights after his father, Robert, left, when I worked 2 jobs to keep a roof over our heads, when I'd lie awake worrying about bills and bullies and whether I was enough. I never thought one of those worries would be that my own son would be ashamed of the evidence of that survival. I I was just making your cake, Michael, I finally managed, my voice a whisper. "Your favorite, dark chocolate fudge." He sighed, a long, suffering sound that suggested I was being deliberately difficult. "I know, Mom, and that's sweet, but Chloe's family is different. They're polished. Her mom is only a few years older than you, and she looks like she just stepped out of a magazine. I just want you to make a good impression." He pushed off the fridge and walked out, leaving me standing there in the silence. The only sound, the hum of the oven preheating, a sound that usually felt so hopeful. Now it felt like a countdown to my own humiliation. I looked at my reflection in the dark screen of the microwave. I saw a woman named Carol, with tired eyes and lines around her mouth that told stories of both joy and sorrow. I saw the face that had kissed Skin's knees and beamed with pride at graduations. I saw me. And for the first time, my own son saw me as ugly. The tears came then, hot and silent, slipping down the very cheeks he wanted me to cover. I thought of my mother, Helen, a woman whose hands were permanently etched with the soil from her garden and the grit of a life well lived. She never would have tolerated such talk. She'd have told me to stand tall, that a woman's face is her history, not her failure. But in the face of Michael's disapproval, all that generational strength felt distant, a whisper from another time. I felt a surge of rebellion, a desire to go out there exactly as I was, to force him to see me. But the fear of pushing him further away, of losing him to the shiny new world he was so eager to join, was stronger. With a heavy heart, I untied the apron and let it fall to the floor. I trudged upstairs to my bedroom, to the little battle station of creams and cosmetics I rarely used. I stood before my vanity, staring at the jars and tubes like they were foreign objects. What was the protocol for covering up a life? I dabbed on foundation, trying to smooth out the lines that framed my eyes, the ones I got from squinting into the sun at all his Little League games. I brushed blush onto cheeks that had hollowed slightly with age and worry. I looked painted, like I was trying to be a version of myself that had never existed. It felt like a betrayal. Just then, my phone buzzed. It was my sister, Linda. My finger hovered over the answer button. A lifeline. But what would I say? Your nephew thinks I'm an embarrassment? The shame was too thick, too personal. I let it go to voicemail. When I came back downstairs, my face feeling like a stiff mask, Michael gave me a curt, approving nod. See? You look presentable. The word was a fresh wound. Presentable. Like a parcel to be mailed. Chloe was perched on the edge of our sofa, a beautiful, slender girl with a perfect blonde blowout and a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She was polite, her manners impeccable, as she made small talk about the weather and the terrible traffic. I tried to engage to be the warm, welcoming mother I'd always imagined I'd be when my son brought someone home. But my heart wasn't in it. I was too acutely aware of the makeup on my face, of the performance I was giving. Michael watched us like a hawk, interjecting with forced laughter, steering the conversation away from any topic he deemed unsophisticated, like my book club or my volunteer work at the library. The doorbell rang, a welcome reprieve. It was Martha, my neighbor and oldest friend, who had been invited for cake, a tradition for as long as I can remember. She bustled in, her own glorious untamed gray hair a cloud around her head, wearing a brightly colored caftan. Carol, darling, the big boy is 27. I can't believe it. She boomed, pulling me into a hug that smelled of lavender and unconditional love. She held me at arm's length, her sharp eyes missing nothing. What's this on your face? You look like you're trying to impersonate someone. Before I could answer, she turned to Michael. And you, still breaking hearts, I see. Then she enveloped a slightly startled Chloe in a similar bear hug. Welcome, sweetheart. Any girlfriend of Michael's has to pass the Martha test, and it involves at least one piece of Carol's legendary cake. Her presence was a gust of fresh, real air in the stifling room. She didn't wait for an invitation. She marched into the kitchen and started pulling down plates, her energy dismantling the tense formality. I followed her, grateful for the distraction. As I opened the oven, the rich, profound scent of dark chocolate and love filled the air. I placed the perfect, beautifully risen cake on the counter to cool, its surface a promise of something genuine and sweet, a stark contrast to the bitter performance unfolding in my living room. It was then, looking at that simple, honest cake, that I made a decision. I slipped away to the half bath under the stairs, and with a wet washcloth, I scrubbed my face clean. The woman staring back at me in the mirror was pale, her eyes a little red, but she was me, Carol, Michael's mother, and that had to be enough. I walked back into the kitchen, my skin tingling from the vigorous scrubbing, feeling strangely naked, yet more like myself than I had all morning. Martha was at the counter, arranging plates and forks, and she glanced up, her eyes softening immediately as they met mine. She didn't say a word, just gave a slow, approving nod that felt like a warm blanket around my shoulders. "The cake's ready to frost," I said, my voice steadier than I expected, and I moved to the refrigerator to retrieve the bowl of dark chocolate frosting I'd made from scratch earlier, the way Michael had always loved it, with a hint of espresso to deepen the flavor. My hands were trembling slightly as I picked up the offset spatula, but the familiar motion of spreading the rich, glossy frosting over the cake's surface was a meditation, a return to something sacred and unchanging. I could hear Michael and Chloe talking in low tones in the living room, and though I couldn't make out the words, the sound of his laughter, a sound that had once been the music of my life, now felt like a needle prick to my heart. Martha leaned in close, her voice a low murmur, meant only for me. "He'll come around, Carol. They always do. Sometimes they have to forget who they are before they remember where they come from." I wanted to believe her, but the hollow ache in my chest told a different story. Just as I was placing the final swirl on the cake, Michael appeared in the kitchen doorway, Chloe hovering behind him like a silent shadow. His eyes scanned me, and I saw the flicker of annoyance when he noticed the makeup was gone, but he didn't comment on it directly. Instead, he focused on the cake. "Looks good, Mom," he said, but his tone was flat, perfunctory, as if he were complimenting a stranger. Chloe's never been a big fan of chocolate, though. She's more of a vanilla person. He gave a little shrug, as if apologizing for her preference, and I felt a fresh wave of hurt. For 27 years, this cake had been our tradition, a symbol of all the birthdays we'd celebrated together, just the two of us after Robert left. Now he was dismissing it for someone he'd known a few months. Chloe offered a tight smile. "It does look lovely, Carol. Very homemade." The word hung in the air, laden with unspoken judgment. Martha snorted, not even trying to hide her disdain. "Homemade is the best kind, sweetheart. It's made with love, not by some machine in a factory. You'll learn that one day." Michael's jaw tightened, and he shot Martha a look that could curdle milk. "Let's just cut the cake, okay? We have reservations at that new bistro downtown in an hour." I took a deep breath, the spatula still in my hand, and looked directly at my son. "We always have cake first on your birthday, Michael. That's the rule." My voice was quiet, but firm, and for a second, I saw a flash of the little boy who would count down the days until his birthday cake, who would beg for a sneak peek of the frosting. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by the impatient man he had become. "Fine, whatever," he muttered, stepping forward to take the knife from the block. I moved to light the candles, 27 of them, a task that suddenly felt monumental, but my hands were unsteady and the match flickered out. Martha quickly lit another and handed it to me, her fingers brushing mine in a gesture of solidarity. I plunged the flame into the first candle, and as I did, a memory surfaced, unbidden and vivid. Michael's 5th birthday, when he'd blown out the candles with such force he'd sputtered little bits of spit onto the cake, and we'd both laughed until we cried. Now, the silence in the room was heavy, broken only by the soft hiss of the candles catching light one by one. We gathered around the cake, the tiny flames casting dancing shadows on our faces. Martha began singing Happy Birthday in her robust, off-key voice, and I joined in, my own voice wavering with emotion. Chloe remained silent, her lips pressed together in a polite smile, while Michael stared at the candles, his expression unreadable. When we finished, he took a deep breath and blew out the candles in one swift, efficient puff, not making a wish, not even closing his eyes. The smoke curled up towards the ceiling, carrying with it the ghosts of all the wishes he'd ever made. "Okay, let's eat," he said, already reaching for the knife. But as he went to cut the first slice, his hand hesitated, and he looked at me, a strange expression crossing his face. "You know, I just remembered. Dad used to hate chocolate cake." The words landed like a physical blow, so unexpected and out of place that I actually took a step back. Robert had left when Michael was only 7, and he'd never been around for birthdays, but he had always loved my chocolate cake. It was one of the few things he ever praised me for. Michael was rewriting history right here in my kitchen, and for what? To impress Chloe? To distance himself further from me? My eyes welled up, but I refused to let the tears fall. "That's not true, Michael," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "Your father loved this cake. He asked for it every year." Michael's face hardened. "No, he didn't. He told me once it was too rich, that he preferred vanilla. You must be misremembering." The gaslighting was so blatant, so cruel, that I felt the room spin slightly. Martha put a steadying hand on my arm. "Michael, that's enough," she said, her voice sharp. "Show your mother some respect." But he ignored her, his attention fixed on me, a challenge in his eyes. It was in that moment that I decided to play the only card I had left. I reached into the pocket of my jeans, where I kept a small, folded piece of paper I carried with me every day, a secret I'd held on to for years. "I think you should try the cake, Michael," I said, my voice gaining strength. Before you say another word, just taste it." He rolled his eyes but cut a slice, placing it on a plate with exaggerated care. He forked a piece, loaded it with frosting, and brought it to his mouth, his expression bored and dismissive. But as the cake touched his tongue, his eyes widened, and he froze, the fork hovering in midair. The flavor, the deep, complex chocolate, the hint of espresso, the unmistakable love baked into every crumb, it was doing its work, unlocking something deep inside him that he'd tried to bury. His face goes pale, and for the first time all day, he looked like my little boy again, vulnerable and unsure. "Mom," he said with a whisper, and his voice cracked, "what did you put in this cake?" The question hung in the air, fragile and charged, as Michael stared at me, his eyes wide with the confusion that seemed to reach deep into his soul. And I knew, in that moment, the cake had done its work, that the familiar flavors had tunneled through all his newfound sophistication and struck a chord in a place he'd long since sealed off. "It's the same recipe I've always used, Michael," I said softly, my hand instinctively going to the worn, folded paper in my pocket, the one I'd copied from my mother's own recipe card decades ago, its edges softened by time and touch. "The one your grandmother Helen taught me when your father and I were first married. The one you used to beg me to make for you even when it wasn't your birthday." He shook his head slowly, his gaze dropping to the half-eaten slice on his plate, as if the cake itself held a truth he wasn't ready to face. "No, it's different. It tastes like before." His voice was barely a whisper, and I saw his throat work as he swallowed, not just the cake, but a rising tide of emotion. Chloe shifted uncomfortably, her polished demeanor cracking for the first time as she glanced between us, sensing a history she wasn't part of, while Martha stood quietly by the sink, her presence a steady anchor in the storm she'd seen brewing for months. "It tastes like home, Michael," I said, my own eyes filling with tears I no longer fought to hide. "It tastes like the kitchen on a rainy afternoon when you were small and we'd bake together, and you'd get flour all over your face and I'd tell you you were my little ghost. It tastes like the birthday when you turned 10 and your father had just left, and we sat at this very table and shared this entire cake between us, promising each other we'd be okay." I watched as my words landed, each one chipping away at the wall he'd built around himself. He looked from the cake to me, and for a fleeting second, I saw the boy he used to be, the one who needed his mom, the one who thought I hung the moon. "Why are you doing this?" he asked, his voice thick with a pain I hadn't heard in years. "Why now?" I pulled the folded paper from my pocket, holding it out to him, my hands trembling. "Because this isn't just a recipe, Michael. It's a story. Our story. And I think you've forgotten how it reads." He hesitated, then reached out and took the paper, unfolding it carefully, as if it were a fragile artifact. His eyes scanned the handwritten words, the list of ingredients, the notes and the margins in my mother's looping script, and then, lower down in my own hand, the added line that made this cake uniquely his. A pinch of espresso powder to remind us that even bitter things can make life richer. But it was what was written on the back that made his breath catch. It was a note from his father, Robert, scribbled in a hurry one long ago birthday. "Carol, this cake is perfect, just like you. Love you always." Michael's face crumpled, the hardened mask he'd worn all day shattering into 1,000 pieces. "He did love it," he whispered, his shoulders slumping as the memory flooded back, real and undeniable. I remember now. He'd always have 2 slices. The confession was a quiet surrender, and the room fell silent except for the soft sound of his ragged breathing. Chloe, looking lost and out of place, finally spoke, her voice small. Maybe I should go. But Michael didn't seem to hear her. He was lost in the past, in the truth he'd tried to bury. I'm sorry, Mom, he said, the words pouring out in a rush. I'm so sorry. I don't know why I said those things. About your face, about the cake. I wanted so badly for everything to be perfect, for Chloe to see that I came from something good. He looked at me, his eyes pleading for forgiveness. But I already came from something good. I came from you. The raw honesty in his voice broke me open, and I stepped forward, wrapping my arms around him, feeling the familiar solidness of my son, the one I'd feared I'd lost. He clung to me, burying his face in my shoulder, and I felt the hot wetness of his tears through my shirt. It's okay, baby, I murmured, stroking his hair, my own tears falling freely now. It's okay. We all get lost sometimes. After a long moment, he pulled back, wiping his eyes, and looked at Chloe, who was still standing by the door, looking uncertain. Chloe, I think I need some time with my mom, he said, his voice gentle but firm. She nodded, offering a weak smile, and let herself out, the click of the door echoing in the sudden quiet. Martha, ever perceptive, quietly began clearing the cake plates, giving us space. Michael and I sat down at the kitchen table, the half-eaten cake between us, and he told me everything. The pressure he felt at his new job, the fear that he wasn't living up to some idealized version of success, the way he'd started to see our simple, loving life as something to be ashamed of. I listened, my heart aching for him, realizing that his cruelty had sprung from his own insecurity, not from any true failure of mine. As we talked, the afternoon light faded into evening, and the kitchen filled with a peace that had been absent for too long. But just as I thought we'd found our way back to each other, Michael looked at me, his expression serious again. Mom, there's something else. Something about Dad that I've never told you. The words hung between us in the quiet kitchen, so heavy and loaded that I could feel the air shift, the comforting warmth from our moment of reconciliation suddenly chilling with the weight of whatever secret Michael was about to unveil. Something about Dad? I repeated, my voice barely a whisper, my mind instantly conjuring images of Robert, the charming, restless man I'd loved, the one who'd left us with a note and a void that never fully closed, and a cold dread began to curl in my stomach. Michael wouldn't meet my eyes. He stared down at his hands, clenched tightly on the table, his knuckles white. After he left, he began, his voice strained. He didn't just disappear completely. He reached out to me. A few years ago, when I was in college, my heart stuttered, a sharp, painful jolt. All those years I'd assumed Robert had vanished from both our lives, that he'd chosen a clean break. But now I was learning he'd maintained a thread to our son, a thread I knew nothing about. He found me on Facebook, and we started talking. Just occasionally at first, then more regularly. He said he wanted to explain, to make things right. I felt a surge of betrayal so acute it stole my breath. Not just at Robert, but at Michael for keeping this from me. For all the times I'd held him while he cried for his father. All the times I'd assured him that some people just aren't built to stay. Why didn't you tell me? I asked, the hurt raw in my voice, and he finally looked up, his eyes swimming with guilt and a pain I now understood was far more complex than I'd ever imagined. He made me promise not to, Michael said, his words tumbling out in a rushed confession. He said it would only hurt you more, that you were better off thinking he was just a deadbeat who didn't care. But it wasn't that simple, Mom. He was sick. The word landed like a physical blow, and I felt the room tilt. Sick? I managed, my mind racing through possibilities, cancer, addiction, something that would have explained his abandonment but also made it infinitely more tragic. Michael nodded, a single tear tracing a path down his cheek. He had bipolar disorder, really severe, and he wasn't diagnosed until after he left us. He told me that in those last years with us, he felt like he was drowning, that he'd have these intense waves of rage and despair he couldn't control, and he was terrified he'd hurt us, that he'd become his own father, a man he had always despised. I thought back to those final turbulent years with Robert, the unexplained absences, the volatile moods I'd attributed to stress or dissatisfaction, never once considering it might be an illness stealing the man I loved from both of us. He said leaving was the hardest thing he'd ever done, Michael went on, but he believed it was the only way to protect us from the worst of him. He spent years in therapy, got on medication, started to build a stable life for himself out in Oregon. He even got remarried, had a little girl. Each piece of information was a fresh wound, a new layer of a story I never knew I was part of. He had a new family, a daughter, a life he'd built while I was piecing ours back together with sweat and tears and a loneliness that never fully faded. I sat there, stunned into silence, the past 20 years of my life shifting and rearranging themselves in light of this new truth. All the anger I'd carried, all the nights I'd spent blaming myself for not being enough to make him stay, all the stories I'd told myself about his selfishness, they all crumbled, leaving behind a confusing rubble of grief and sympathy. He wanted to meet me, Michael said, his voice softening. Last year, I flew out to see him. He's okay now. Really okay. He's a good guy, Mom. He's sorry for everything. He asked about you. I felt a sob rise in my throat, but I choked it back, my hands trembling as I reached for my cooling cup of tea. Why are you telling me this now? I asked, though a part of me already knew. It was the same reason he'd insulted my appearance, the same drive to reshape his origins into something neater, something that fit the narrative of the successful man he was trying to become. He wanted to reconcile the two halves of himself, the boy from a broken home and the man with a father who wasn't a monster, just a flawed, sick human being who made a terrible choice for what he thought were the right reasons. Michael took a deep breath. Because when I was with him, I saw how he looked at his new wife, his new daughter. He has this peace I never saw when he was with us. And it made me realize that I've been so angry for so long, not just at him, but at you, for letting him go, for not fighting harder, for being, well, for being just Mom. His words were like a knife, but they were also the most honest thing he'd said all day. I think I blamed you for our life being hard, for us struggling, for me not having a dad. And when I met Chloe and I saw her perfect family with their perfect house and their perfect vacations, I was ashamed of our story. I wanted to bury it. But today, with the cake, with you, it all just came rushing back, and I realized I can't bury it. I don't want to anymore. He reached across the table and took my hand, his grip firm, his eyes earnest. I'm so sorry, Mom, for everything, for the things I said, for the secrets I kept. I love you, and I'm proud of you. I'm proud to be your son. The tears finally came then, hot and relentless, washing away the residue of hurt and misunderstanding. And we sat there in the dimming light, holding hands across the table, the cake between us a silent witness to our messy, imperfect, but enduring love. But even as relief flooded through me, a new question began to form, a whisper from the past that now demanded an answer. If Robert was truly sorry, and if he was now stable, did that change anything? Did it change everything? The question echoed in the stillness of the kitchen, a seismic shift in the foundation of my entire adult life. If Robert was sick, not cruel, if he left to protect us, not to abandon us, did that change everything? The anger I had worn like a coat of armor for 2 decades suddenly felt ill-fitting, heavy and misplaced, and beneath it, an old, familiar ache began to throb, the ache of a love that had been severed not by malice, but by despair. I looked at Michael, my son, who had carried this colossal secret alone, and I saw not a betrayer, but a boy who had been trying to make sense of a story that was too big for him. It changes the shape of it all, I said slowly, my voice trembling as I tried to put words to the upheaval inside me. The why? It changes the why. I thought of the countless nights I'd lain awake, replaying our last bitter arguments, wondering what I could have done differently, what fatal flaw in me had driven him away. Now I was being told it wasn't about me at all. It was about a storm in his own mind he couldn't weather. The relief was profound, a physical unclenching of muscles I didn't know I'd been holding taut for 20 years. But it was immediately followed by a devastating wave of grief for him, for the man suffering in silence, and for us, for the life that was stolen by an undiagnosed illness. Michael watched me, his expression a mixture of fear and hope. He wanted to reach out to you, Mom, so many times, but he was afraid, ashamed. He thought you'd never forgive him, and he said you'd be right not to. He squeezed my hand. He never stopped loving you. He told me that. He said leaving you was the biggest regret of his life. The words washed over me, healing and hurting in equal measure. All the hardened scars of my heart felt suddenly fresh and raw. Martha, who had been a silent, supportive statue in the corner, finally moved, bringing over the teapot and refilling our cups. "Life sure has a way of being messier than we ever planned, doesn't it, Carol?" she said, her wisdom a gentle balm. I nodded, unable to speak, clutching the warm mug like a lifeline. The world I knew had been tilted on its axis, and I was struggling to find my footing. "What do you want to do, Mom?" Michael asked, his voice tentative. The cake, the initial reason for this gathering, sat forgotten between us, a symbol of a past that now looked entirely different. I looked around my kitchen, at the familiar cracks in the linoleum, the faded curtains, the photos of Michael on the fridge, a timeline of the life I had built alone. For so long, that life had been defined by Robert's absence. Now, his presence, even as a ghost from the past, demanded a redefinition. "I don't know," I answered honestly. I need to sit with this. It's a lot to process." A part of me, the part that had been the lonely, struggling single mother, wanted to rage at the unfairness of it all, the lost years, the unnecessary struggle. Another part, the woman who had once loved a man named Robert with her whole heart, felt a piercing sorrow for his solitary battle. "Thank you for telling me," I finally said, looking at my son. "It must have been a terrible burden to carry by yourself." His shoulders slumped with visible relief, as if a physical weight had been lifted from them. "It was," he whispered. "I hated lying to you, especially when you were having a hard time. I wanted to tell you so badly, but I felt like I was betraying him, too." We talked for another hour, the three of us, as the night deepened outside the window. Michael shared more about his trip to Oregon, about the man his father had become. Softer, quieter, deeply remorseful. He showed me a photo on his phone of Robert with his little daughter, a sweet-faced girl with Robert's same smiling eyes. The pang of jealousy was sharp and immediate, but it was followed by a strange sense of peace. He had found a measure of happiness, And somehow, that didn't diminish my own. It just made the tragedy of our story feel a little less absolute. Eventually, Martha hugged us both and slipped out, sensing we needed time alone. Michael and I cleaned the kitchen together, moving in the familiar, silent rhythm we'd perfected over the years. But the air between us was different now, cleared of the resentment that had fogged it for months. When he left, promising to call me tomorrow, the house felt emptier than usual, but the silence was no longer lonely. It was contemplative. I wandered into the living room and pulled an old photo album from the shelf, its faux leather cover cracked with age. I sat on the sofa and opened it, the first picture hitting me with the force of a physical blow. Robert and me on our wedding day, young and impossibly bright-eyed, his arms slung around my waist, my head thrown back in laughter. I traced the outline of his face, seeing now the subtle shadows in his eyes that I had mistaken for pre-wedding jitters. I spent the next hour immersed in a past I thought I understood, now viewing every memory through this new, heartbreaking lens. The man in these photos wasn't a monster. He was a man fighting a war inside his own head. The grief that washed over me was fresh, as if he had just left yesterday. But it was a cleaner grief, untarnished by bitterness. I closed the album and looked out at the dark, quiet street. The question remained, large and unresolved in the quiet house. What now? Did this new truth require action? Did it require my forgiveness? And if I offered it, what would that even look like after all this time? The silence in the house after Michael left was a living thing, thick with the echoes of his confession and the ghost of Robert, who was no longer the villain of my story but a tragically flawed man I suddenly had to learn to see all over again. I stayed on the sofa for a long time, the photo album heavy on my lap, the faces of our younger selves staring back at me with a hope that now felt like a prophecy of heartbreak. Bipolar disorder. The words rolled around in my mind, rearranging the furniture of my memory. The time he'd stayed up for 3 days straight, painting the entire house in a frantic, furious burst of energy I'd mistaken for passion. The crushing, depressive slumps that would follow, where he could barely get out of bed, and I'd attributed it to laziness or a lack of commitment to our family. I felt a shuddering wave of guilt so potent it nauseated me. Why hadn't I seen it? Why had I been so quick to blame him and then myself? The answer was simple and cruel. We didn't have the words for it back then. It was just his moods, something to be endured, a flaw in his character, not a symptom of a disease. I finally stood, my body aching as if I'd run a marathon, and climbed the stairs to the attic, a place I rarely ventured, a tomb of memories I'd sealed shut. The air was dusty and still, filled with the scent of old paper and forgotten things. In the far corner, under a faded quilt, was the cardboard box I was looking for, labeled R in my own hesitant script from years ago. I carried it down to my bedroom, my heart hammering against my ribs. Sitting on the edge of my bed, I lifted the lid. Inside were the relics of us. A stack of love letters tied with a ribbon, the concert ticket stub from our first date, a silly poem he'd written for me when I was pregnant with Michael. And at the very bottom, a small, flat jewelry box. I opened it, and there it was, the silver locket he'd given me on our 5th anniversary, the one I'd torn from my neck in a rage the day I found his goodbye note and thrown into this box, vowing never to look at it again. My fingers trembled as I picked it up. The clasp was stiff, but it opened. Inside were 2 tiny, faded photographs, one of Robert, one of a baby Michael. I stared at his young, smiling face, and for the first time in 20 years, I didn't feel anger. I felt a profound, devastating pity. He had been living in a prison inside his own skull, and he pushed away the only people who could have loved him through it, because he believed, with every fractured part of himself, that he was protecting us. I don't know how long I sat there, holding the locket, the cold metal warming in my palm. The question was no longer abstract. It was a pressing, urgent force in the quiet room. What now? The forgiveness I had wrestled with for decades now felt less like a mountain to climb and more like a door I simply had to choose to open. It wouldn't erase the past, it wouldn't give me back those years of struggle and loneliness, but it could, perhaps, set me free from the weight of it. It was nearly midnight. I didn't stop to think, to talk myself out of it. I walked to my bedside table, picked up my phone, and with a resolve that felt both terrifying and peaceful, I asked Michael for his father's number. The response came a moment later, just a string of digits that felt like holding a live wire. My thumb hovered over the call button, my breath caught in my throat. This wasn't about rekindling a romance or even building a friendship. It was about something more fundamental. Acknowledgement. It was about telling him that I finally saw his struggle, that the narrative of our ending was forever changed. I took a deep, shuddering breath and pressed call. The line rang once, twice, in the late-night silence of an Oregon home I'd never seen. And then a voice, deeper, older, but unmistakably his, answered, "Hello?" I closed my eyes, the locket clenched tight in my fist. "Robert, it's Carol. We need to talk." The silence on the other end of the line was so profound and stretched so long I thought the connection had been lost, that I was just holding a dead phone to my ear in the midnight quiet of my bedroom. But then I heard it. A sharp, shaky intake of breath, followed by a sound that was half sob, half whisper. "Carol?" My name on his lips was a ghost, an echo from a lifetime ago, and it unleashed a torrent of feeling so violent I had to sit down on the edge of the bed, my legs suddenly unable to hold me. "Yes," I said, my own voice thick with a lifetime of unshed tears. "Michael was here today. He told me everything, Robert." There was another silence, but this one was different, filled with the weight of his fear, his shame, his 20 years of waiting for this call. When he spoke again, his voice was ragged, stripped bare. "I don't even know where to start. I'm so sorry, Carol. I am so, so sorry. There aren't enough words in the world to tell you how sorry I am." He was crying now, openly, and the sound was both alien and intimately familiar, tearing open a scar I thought had long since calloused over. I listened as he poured it all out, his words a frantic, jumbled confession, the terrifying racing thoughts that made him feel like he was losing his mind, the black depressions that left him paralyzed, the unbearable guilt he felt every time he looked at our happy, innocent son and his stable, loving wife, knowing he was a cracked foundation that would eventually make the whole house collapse. "I thought if I left, I could fix myself," he choked out. "And then, maybe, if I could become whole, I could come back. But the years went by, and the medication helped, the therapy helped, but the damage was done. I knew I'd lost the right to ever come back. I saw the life you built with Michael, and I didn't want to disrupt it. I thought my silence was my final gift to you." His reasoning, framed in the twisted logic of his illness, was both heartbreaking and infuriating. "A gift?" I whispered, the old anger flaring for a moment. "Robert, you left a hole. You left a 7-year-old boy who thought his father didn't love him, and a woman who spent 20 years believing she wasn't enough. There is no gift in that." "I know," he said, his voice small and broken. "I know that now. It was the greatest mistake of my life. A catastrophic, arrogant mistake. I thought I was being noble, but I was just being selfish and sick and scared." He told me about his diagnosis, about the first time a doctor put a name to the chaos in his head, and how he'd wept with a relief that was quickly swallowed by a deeper, more profound regret. He told me about his wife, Brenda, a kind, no-nonsense nurse he'd met in a support group who knew his entire history and had helped him build a quiet, careful life. He spoke of his daughter, Emily, who was 12 and loved science and soccer, and how being her father was both a joy and a constant, painful reminder of the father he'd failed to be for Michael. I listened, truly listened. Not as his wife, not as the woman he'd left behind, but as a human being to another. And I began to understand the immense, tragic scale of the prison he had been in. The anger slowly bled away, leaving behind a vast, aching sadness for the man who was, for the family we could have been, if only we'd had the knowledge, the tools, the support. After what felt like an hour, the storm of his confession subsided, leaving a weary, fragile calm in its wake. "Thank you," he said softly, "for calling, for listening. I didn't deserve that." I looked down at the locket, still pressed into my palm. "I'm not doing this for you, Robert," I said, and it was the truth. I'm doing it for me and for Michael. We deserved the truth. We deserved to have our story told correctly. I took a deep breath. "I forgive you." The words left my mouth, and I felt their truth resonate through my entire being. It wasn't a forgiveness that erased the past or meant everything was okay. It was a forgiveness that acknowledged his humanity, his illness, and his profound regret. It was a forgiveness that set me free from the burden of carrying the anger any longer. I heard his sharp gasp on the other end of the line, followed by a quiet, broken weep of gratitude. We talked for a few minutes more, the conversation softer now, about Michael, about how proud we both were of the man he'd become. When we finally hung up, the first light of dawn was tinting the edges of my window. I felt hollowed out, scraped clean, but also, for the first time in 2 decades, truly light. I placed the locket back in its box, not as an act of rejection, but as a gentle closing of a chapter. I had gotten my answer. I had given my forgiveness. But as I lay down, exhausted, a new thought, both terrifying and intriguing, whispered at the edge of my consciousness. He was no longer a ghost. He was a real person living a real life just a phone call away. And our son was a living bridge between his 2 separate worlds. The dawn light that filtered through my window seemed different, as if the world itself had been washed clean and was holding its breath, just like I was. I didn't sleep. How could I? The tectonic plates of my past had shifted, and the landscape of my life was now unrecognizable. I lay there watching the room brighten, tracing the patterns of light on the ceiling, feeling the echo of Robert's voice, a voice I hadn't heard in 20 years, still vibrating in the air around me. The forgiveness I had offered was real, a solid, quiet thing in the center of my chest. But it didn't magically erase the complexity of what came next. He was no longer a phantom of my anger or my grief. He was a man named Robert, living in Oregon with a wife named Brenda and a daughter named Emily. He was my son's other parent, and that fact alone changed everything and nothing all at once. I got up and moved through the morning on autopilot, the familiar rituals of coffee and toast, feeling both grounding and strangely surreal. Every object in my house seemed to hold a new meaning. The photograph of Michael's high school graduation on the mantle, Robert had missed that. The slightly crooked bookshelf I had built myself after he left, he would never know the struggle of holding the wood steady, my tears mixing with the sawdust. My life, built so independently for so long, now had a shadow history, a parallel universe where a sick man had made a choice that altered all our destinies. As I sipped my coffee, the phone rang, making me jump. It was Michael. "I couldn't sleep," he said, his voice hushed with a mixture of anxiety and hope. "I saw your text that you called him. How did it go?" I could hear the weight of his world in that question. He had been the keeper of this secret, the bridge between 2 broken shores, and now the fate of both lands rested on his shoulders. "It was hard and sad and necessary," I told him, and I could feel his relief through the phone line. "I forgive him, Michael. I really do." I heard his shaky exhale. "Oh, Mom," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Thank you." We talked for a while, and the distance that had grown between us over the past months seemed to evaporate completely, burned away by the raw, shared truth of the night. He told me he'd broken things off with Chloe, that he'd realized he was trying to fit into a mold of someone he wasn't, and that he needed to figure out who he was on his own terms without the pressure of impressing anyone. I felt a surge of pride so fierce that it brought fresh tears to my eyes. My son was coming back to himself, and in doing so, he was coming back to me. After we hung up, the house felt peaceful, but my mind was anything but. A quiet, persistent thought began to form, a question not about the past, but about the future. What did this new chapter look like? Did Robert remain a voice on the phone, a story from the past? Or was there room for him to have a small, defined place in our present? And if there was, what would that mean for me? For the carefully constructed solitary life that I had learned to call my own? The forgiveness was given, the truth was out. But the path forward was still shrouded in fog, and I was standing at the edge of it, unsure of my first step. The fog of that new, uncertain future seemed to seep into the very walls of my kitchen, the steam from my coffee cup doing little to chase it away. The conversation with Robert felt like a dream, a haunting, emotional specter that had visited in the night and left its imprint on the dawn. I could still hear the raw ache in his voice, the devastating relief when I'd said those 3 words, "I forgive you," and I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that a part of me would always mourn the life we might have had if illness hadn't stolen it from us. But another part, the part that had weathered 2 decades of single motherhood, of financial fear and lonely nights, felt a strange, burgeoning sense of peace. The battle was over. The war I'd been waging against a ghost was finally done. When Michael came over later that afternoon, the change in him was palpable. The defensive posture, the critical edge, was gone. He looked like my son again. His shoulders relaxed, his eyes clear, as he helped me wash the last of the birthday cake plates that had started it all. "He called me this morning," Michael said, his voice soft as he scrubbed at a spot of frosting. He sounded lighter, like he could finally breathe. He said talking to you was like having a stone lifted from his chest that he'd been carrying for 20 years. I nodded, my throat tight, because I felt the exact same unburdening. We didn't talk about the future, not directly. We didn't make plans or speculate about holidays or what role, if any, Robert would play in our lives from now on. Instead, we talked about the past with new understanding, sharing memories that were now viewed through the clarifying lens of truth. Michael recalled a time Robert had taken him to the zoo and had gotten so agitated by the crowds they'd had to leave early, and how he thought his father was angry with him. Now, he understood it was likely a symptom of overstimulation and anxiety. I remembered a period of profound lethargy where Robert could barely get out of bed for a week, and I nagged him about pulling his weight. My own fear and frustration made me cruel. We were piecing our history back together, not to dwell in it, but to heal it, to grant our younger selves the grace we hadn't known how to give at the time. It was exhausting and cathartic, and when Michael left that evening, he hugged me so tightly I felt the last of the distance between us collapse into dust. The following days passed in a quiet, reflective haze. The world outside my window went on as it always had, but inside, I was different. I found myself looking at my reflection without the critical eye Michael had imposed upon me. I saw the lines and the gray hair not as flaws, but as evidence of a life lived, of battles fought and survived. I even went out and bought a new apron, a cheerful, bright yellow one, and I hung it on the hook with a sense of defiance and self-acceptance. I was Carol, and I was enough. A week after the phone call, another letter arrived from Robert. This one was not a surprise. He'd asked for my permission to write. It was a long, thoughtful handwritten letter, devoid of the frantic emotion of our call. In it, he elaborated on his journey, his treatment, his deep and abiding love for our son, and his respect for the woman I had become without him. He did not ask for anything, He did not presume a future. He simply laid his truth on the page as an offering, a final piece of the puzzle for me to hold. I read it 3 times, then placed it in the box with the locket. Not to hide it away, but to keep it safe. The story was complete. But as I closed the box lid, I realized that while one story had ended, another was just beginning. The question was no longer about the past. It was about the courage to step into a future that was suddenly, wonderfully, and terrifyingly wide open. The door was open. The choice of whether to walk through it was now, and would always be, entirely my own.